Now, in the Music Zone, Maria Maria. Padraig O'Rourke traces the life and career of the 20th century's greatest singing actress, Maria Callas.
"75 years ago today, a daughter, Maria Anna Sophia Cecilia, was born in the Flower Hospital on Fifth Avenue, New York, to Greek immigrant parents, George and Evangelia Callas. George and Evangelia had married in 1916 in Greece and already had 2 children, a daughter known as Jackie and a son, Vasily, who had died at the age of 3 from meningitis. Like many Greek immigrants, Callas found his name presented difficulties of pronunciation, and so he shortened it to Callas. Their marriage was an unhappy one, and although the birth of their new daughter created a new interest, Evangelia resigned herself to being an efficient, though rather dictatorial, housewife. She herself was one of 11 children born to a well-to-do Greek family, and when they moved to Athens, she met and fell in love with the dashing George, who was a pharmacist and the son of a farming family. Evangelia's father was unimpressed by her choice. George was her senior by 13 years, and farmers were considered inferior to business folk. George's desire to emigrate to the United States could be attributed to his wish to succeed on his own and not to have his success dependent on his wife's fantastic family. Maria, rather short-sighted and as a result bespectacled from the age of 5, grew up a somewhat shy, quiet girl, well-behaved and even religious. But apart from her much older sister, she had no opportunities to make friends. As her mother wasn't keen to have other youngsters in the house, her own daughters were seldom invited to their school friends' homes. The musical influences on the young Maria in those years were Jeanette MacDonald and Lily Pons, whom she heard in Saturday afternoon broadcasts from the Metropolitan Opera. She heard her in Lucia de Lammermoor, a role she would later fill with distinction. One day she declared, "I'm going to be a bigger star than her." Curiously enough, in later life she denied ever having had such ambition. She also entered talent competitions, but not under her own name, because her father objected to his wife's ambition for their young daughter. And so it was that as Nina Foresti she appeared on Major Bowes' Amateur Hour on the 7th of April, 1935.
What's your ambition? Operatic, concert, radio?
Well, my ambitions were very high, but since my father's laboratories are closed.
Father was a chemist. Well, what are you doing now?
Oh, I'm employed in the toy department of a large department store.
And you want to sing something from Puccini, huh?
Yes, I would like to.
Yes, I thought so. They all do. All right, what do you want to sing?
Something of Madame Butterfly.
All right.
A bit abbreviated.
That's good. Go ahead.
In 1937, just after she entered high school, Callas and her mother left America for Greece. Her sister Jackie had left some months earlier, and it said that George, on hearing that Evangelia was leaving him to return to Greece, knelt down and gave thanks to God. It was in Athens that Callas had her first formal musical training.
They brought me to the conservatory, and they had to fake my age, because of course I was then 13 years old, and no conservatory would accept you. And I was very tall and well-built, so I easily passed for 17 years old. In Greece, I made an 8-year career. We were, kept there during the war. I could have come back, but I didn't feel it right or proper, I don't know, to leave my mother and my sister, so I stayed on.
Her first stage appearance was in a student production of Cavalleria Rusticana in Athens in 1939.
I started very early. My teacher, who was Elvira de Hidalgo, started very early because she had the real great training maybe even the last great training of the real bel canto. As a young girl, which means 13 years old, I was immediately thrown into her arms.
Elvira de Hidalgo had been a highly respected singer both at La Scala and at the Met, where she'd appeared with Caruso. She introduced Callas to the world of the early 19th century repertoire, Rossini, Bellini and Donizetti. To Callas, she became a mother figure and the centre of her life.
I was fascinated by listening to all her pupils, the mezzo-sopranos, even tenors, and it was most interesting because you learned a lot. So I used to go to the conservatoire, 10 o'clock in the morning, and I used to leave with the last pupil. Even de Hidalgo was quite amazed because she was asking me frequently, why do you stay here? My answer was that even from the least talented pupil, he can teach you something that you might not be able to do.
It was during this time in Greece that Callas, at Hidalgo's insistence, learned to speak Italian, a task she accomplished in 2 months. Then, with the war over, Callas returned to America to pursue a career.
I came to America, and here I am, a very young girl of 21 with no one to believe in you. In fact, I remember poor old Merolin, who was San Francisco Opera House then, the director, heard me and he said, oh, lovely voice, lovely this, lovely that. He says, but, you know, you're too young. Oh, no, he says, I couldn't trust a 21-year-old girl. He says, look, you go to Italy and make yourself a wonderful career and then I'll engage you.
And she also auditioned at the Metropolitan Opera in New York.
I auditioned for them. And they offered me parts that I didn't think fit for me. For instance, Butterfly, then I think I was too young, maybe a little bit too heavy. For a debut, it wouldn't have been right. I mean, if they had heard me in other operas, I could have taken over Butterfly also. But I always had these kind of other people call funny ideas, and I consider only doing my job well. And then they offered me Fidelio in English, and forgive me, but I really don't believe in opera sung in English. So I just had to refuse, and then I was supposed to open the season at, I think it was called the United States Opera Company in Chicago, and that blew up. And finally, I had the wonderful chance of meeting Zenatello and being signed up for La Gioconda at the Arena di Verona.
Giovanni Zenatello, a former top-ranking tenor, was in charge of revitalizing the summer season at Verona. Through him, Callas met the 2 men most influential in her career, the conductor, Tullio Serafin, and a wealthy industrialist, Giovanni Battista Meneghini, who would become her husband. She made her Italian debut in the Arena at Verona on the 2nd of August 1947 as Ponchielli's La Gioconda. But despite her success there, Callas received few offers of work. Only her husband's wealth enabled her to bide her time. The doors of La Scala remained firmly shut to her, as explained by the composer Giancarlo Menotti, who wanted her to sing in the Scala premiere of his opera The Consul. He found it impossible to convince the theatre's general manager, Antonio Ghiringhelli.
So I called Ghiringhelli and I said, I found my singer. Her name is Maria Callas. Ghiringhelli said, Maria Callas, oh my God, no, never, never, never. I will not have Maria Callas in this theater unless she only comes as a guest artist. So I went back to Callas, we had another meeting, and I said, well, Ghiringhelli will be very happy, of course I had to lie, to have you on La Scala, but only as a guest artist. So Maria looked very surprised and quite indignant. I said, I'm sorry, Mr. Menotti, but unless I go back to La Scala as a regular artist, I will not put my foot in that theater again. But curious enough, before we left each other that day, she stopped me as I was going out of the door and she said, Mr. Menotti, I want you to remember one thing, however, that I will sing at La Scala, and that Ghiringhelli will pay for this for the rest of his life.
But Ghiringhelli couldn't hold out against the power of the Callas personality or the excitement generated by her singing. She made her formal debut on the opening night of the 1951 season in Verdi's I Vespri Siciliani, inaugurating a period in the theatre's history known as the Callas era. In 1952, Callas returned to Mexico City, where she'd sung in the 2 previous seasons, and this provided her first encounter with the tenor Giuseppe Di Stefano. They appeared together in 5 operas.
Puritani, Lucia, Traviata, Tosca e Rigoletto. And this was my destiny, to sing with Callas.
And 1952 also brought Callas's London debut as Norma. And in the following spring, she undertook another taxing role with which she would be forever associated, Cherubini's Medea. It was during this time that she became concerned about her physical appearance, in particular, her weight.
I was doing Medea then. My first instinct was saying that the face is too fat and I can't stand it because I needed the chin for expression. So I was annoyed. I darkened the color of all that, but it's nonsense. You can't do that. I went to Rome to sing Lucia. Singing Lucia was such a hard ordeal for me in the first act. I was getting so heavy that even my vocalizing was heavy. So I was tiring myself, I was perspiring too much, and I really was working too hard. And then I was tired of playing again, like for instance playing a beautiful young woman, and I was a heavy, uncomfortable woman to move around. And I felt now if I'm going to do things right, I studied all my life to put things right musically, why don't I just diet and put myself into a certain condition that I'm presentable.
Now 80 pounds lighter, she set out to make her American debut as Norma in Chicago, where the conductor was Niccolo Rescigno.
Maria did not know how to mark. Now, mark is a technical word that we use in the profession to say when you're not singing full voice. So what came out was really very strange. She started off her sounding like a cat meowing around the place. What I did get, the diction, the meaning behind every line, tremendous concentration. We could rest for 5 minutes and then go right back in. And I think that if one were to ask me what Maria Callas's principal asset was, I would have to say willpower.
That first night in Chicago established Callas's name in America. The following year, 1955, she returned to Chicago again to sing Madama Butterfly for her first and only time on stage.
We had the 3 performances scheduled, but the demand for tickets was such that we persuaded Maria to do a 4th performance. And I remember it was sold out like in half an hour, just lines around the building at Wacker Drive there in Chicago. Maria had a contract from her young days with a certain Mr. Bagarozzi. He was after her for money, and I think the theater had assured her that we would try to protect her from this type of invasion. I went to the theater that night. Kelly and Fox came to my dressing room and told me that Maria was going to be served with papers. I felt a loyalty to Maria. I knew what this meant to her, and I had the tremendous dilemma whether to tell her. And I don't know if I was wise or not, but I did not tell her. Maria was very happy because it had gone very well and the audience was delirious and it was her last night and she was going on to her next big engagement. After the curtain calls, we were going to our dressing rooms. This gentleman presented Maria. She thought he was, she was half blind anyway. She thought he was somebody who wanted her autograph or something. Instead, it turned out to be the process server. And then there was a photographer there who snapped that famous picture that dubbed Maria the Tigress of Opera. That started the big rift between Maria and the Chicago people. As a matter of fact, she never appeared in Chicago again.
That photo of Callas snarling at the Chicago process server appeared in newspapers all over the world and depicted her as a tempestuous and temperamental artist. Her colleagues, on the other hand, knew her as a complete professional and a singer devoted to her art.
Maria was first and foremost a great musician. She never really bent the music to suit her vocal problems or virtues, but she put it at the service. Now, I don't want her to sound like a goddess because, thank God, she had clay feet. But all of her effects were always within the scope of the score. Her dealing of recitativo, the way she dealt with cadenzas that were meaningful, the blend that she succeeded in getting, let's say, between the registers. These are things that Maria had a little bit by nature, because Maria was a little bit the embodiment of the old prima donna.
That was the first major scandal to rock Callas's career. In 1955, she was regarded as opera's foremost singer and personality. Just a few months before her final Chicago performances, she gave what she and most of her admirers considered was the pinnacle performance of her career. A performance of Lucia de Lammermoor at the Berlin Städtische Oper on the 29th of September 1955, conducted by Karajan.
When I prepare a role in the beginning, the outline is, this is how she's supposed to move because this is her background and culture or whatever it is.
The main thing, I believe, is not the libretto, is mainly, though I give enormous attention to the words, I try to find truth in the music.
You take the music and you learn it as you were in the conservatoire. In other words, exactly as it's written, nothing more and nothing less, which is the phrase that I call straitjacketing.
The conductor gives you his cuts. If you have cadenzas, he gives you ideas about what his cadenzas would be. And his cadenzas, I mean, are never his if he's a conscientious conductor. He always builds his cadenzas according to the taste and the liking and the particular makings of the composer. If you're dealing with sentiments, with characters, with music, let us deal with less florid things, or rather, let us use embellishments to the service of expression. If you care that much for the composers and not for your own private success, you will always find a trill or an embellishment or a scale that justifies a feeling of happiness or of unhappiness, of uneasiness, anxiety.
And then, when familiar with the music and its possibilities, the notes themselves had to be learned.
Then you learn the role exactly as ABCD. When you've learned that, you try to speak it to yourself as you have the recitative. They are the introductions to the arias. Once upon a time, 150 years ago, the public just used to walk out, eat, laugh, and would come in for the big pieces. Thank heavens now they don't. Once you learn how it's written and the exact value of each note and each phrase, then, and this I have learned from Serafin in occasion of my Norma, so he said, very well, you know the music perfectly well. Now you go home, my dear Miss Callas, and speak it to yourself. And let's see if, with what proportions, with what rhythm you come back to me tomorrow.
It was as Norma that Callas made her long-awaited debut at the Metropolitan on the 29th of October 1956. It was preceded by an unflattering cover story in Time magazine, rehashing all the Callas clichés, the temperamental soprano, the difficult colleague, her rivalry with the great Renata Tebaldi, and her quarrels with her mother. And when it came to her voice, it was clear she knew it was a controversial sound.
Some people say I have a beautiful voice, some people say I have not. It's a matter of opinion. Some people say I have a unique voice, and some people say it's just a whole big lie. People who don't like me can just not come and hear me. As for unique, I don't know whether it is unique. I think it's not. I think I'm just doing what once upon a time was done. Once upon a time, sopranos were considered sopranos, not light or heavy or medium or whatever you call it. A soprano was supposed to do every kind of opera. It's like a violinist, a pianist. It has to perform any kind of music.
She was asked to contrast singing at La Scala with performing at the Met.
On one side, I'm happier at the Scala because you see the Scala has more money. The Scala has, I can't say more tradition because the Metropolitan has an enormous tradition. I have sung there more. You see, at the Metropolitan, I have only had 2 months' work there. Forgive my word job because it's so vulgar. I have given birth to so many operas at the Scala, where at the Metropolitan, no. The opera house in itself is lovelier. The acoustic is much nicer. At the Met, unfortunately, we do not have a nice acoustic. And I'm afraid that's why I can't be very happy. You see, when you sing at the Metropolitan, you lose control of your voice because you don't hear it at all, so you force yourself. I will do my best to be happy at the Met, especially because the public has been so wonderful to me, and I've been so very happy with Mr. Bing.
Mr. Bing was the Viennese-born general manager of the Metropolitan. He tried for several years to convince Callas to sing at the Met, but fees and repertoire were a stumbling block. On one occasion, he cynically remarked that Callas wanted more money than the President of the United States. Promptly offering to stand down, Callas answered, "Let him sing then." Be that as it may, in the autumn of 1955, while Callas was singing in Chicago, Bing arrived and her difficulties with the Met were resolved. But the following year, 1956, brought further trouble for Callas, this time at La Scala. The public was becoming less willing to tolerate the growing unsteadiness in her voice. Some blamed her dramatic weight loss, but her top notes had become unruly long before she slimmed down. A more likely explanation was that Callas had put more pressure on her voice than it could comfortably bear. The first signs of difficulty showed in her top register, which began to wobble out of control. In a performance of the Barber of Seville at La Scala, Callas ended the lesson scene on a strident and unmusical high note. The audience remained well-behaved until the tenor's line, "Bella voce," what a beautiful voice. It was more than the anti-Callas faction could accept. Walter Legg, Callas's long-time record producer, told an interviewer of another anti-Callas demonstration at La Scala.
It was the habit of her fans to occupy the seats in the gallery nearest to the stage, and when she took her curtain calls at the end of the opera, to shower her with small bouquets. The fans of a rival soprano decided they would disturb this. So they had bunches of radishes and bunches of carrots and other small vegetables. They got there earlier than the Callas fans, occupied the seats nearest to the proscenium arch. And instead of Callas getting her usual shower of bouquets, she got a shower of vegetables and, of course, some bouquets from her own fans. She is very short-sighted. And she walked down, picked up each of these offerings from the floor, sniffed them. The vegetables were dropped into the orchestra. The flowers were handed to her colleagues. It was one of the supreme examples of absolute sovereignty of the stage and quickness of thinking of it.
But there were also great successes at La Scala to counterbalance the failures. In 1957, Callas triumphed in a production of Un ballo in maschera with tenor Giuseppe Di Stefano. Considering what Callas and Di Stefano were to mean to each other later on, it's ironic that they were often adversaries. Walter Legg, who was married to another great soprano, Elizabeth Schwarzkopf, told this story to an interviewer on the BBC.
I thought I found a marvellous couple, the sort of Caruso and Melba, what Caruso and Melba were at Covent Garden. And this tenor's, or his wife, found out that Callas, like my wife, is allergic to the smell of garlic, because they both get a surplus of saliva in the mouth, very smell of garlic. So this tenor's wife started standing in the wings, and before every love duet or every embrace, the tenor walked to the wings, stretched out a hand, took 4 or 5 pieces of garlic, shoved them in his mouth, chewed them, and then embraced Callas, who could not get rid of the surplus saliva that she got in her mouth.
Her triumphs at La Scala in 57 were the calm before the major storm in her career. Callas was engaged to open the 1958 season in Rome with a gala performance of Norma to be given in the presence of the President of Italy, Giovanni Gronchi. Callas had caught a cold during rehearsals, and as opening night approached and it grew worse, she felt she'd have to cancel.
I told him I'm not well. Now, something might come wrong. Who is my double? Nobody can double Callas. Oh, I said to Pauli, I said, look, Guido. And I knew him since ages, because he had heard me since I was first coaching with Serafin in 47. I said, look, Guido, let's look facts in the face. After tomorrow is a performance, and it's an opening night, and you have the president. If I get sick, who will? He says, nobody can double Callas. All right. So you take the responsibility of saying, Callas was sick, and we will not substitute her. I was sick. I could not continue, because if I was well, I would have continued, and I was spitting their faces at my enemies, because I don't like it. But if I am attacked, I must defend myself. And if I can make my enemies I would not kill them, but if I could make them go on their knees in front of me, I can, I will, and I must.
From the beginning of the performance, it was obvious that Callas was in vocal trouble. At the end of the first act, an announcement was made that the performance would have to be cancelled. Next morning, the newspaper headlines proclaimed, Callas walks out on the President of Italy. She sued the Rome Opera to clear her name, but it took a decade before she got a judgment in her favour, by which time the Rome walkout had become part of the Callas myth. The 1955 incident with the Chicago process server and the Rome walkout were the first round of scandals which would eventually destroy the career and self-confidence of Maria Callas. In 1957, a new opera company had been founded in Dallas by Nicola Rescigno and Lawrence Kelly, Callas's associates from the Chicago Opera Company. During her second season there in 1958, negotiations were going on with Rudolph Bing, general manager of the Metropolitan Opera, concerning Callas's return to New York. But Callas was unhappy with the Met's schedule of alternating La Traviata with Macbeth, operas that demanded almost entirely different voices. Bing gave her an ultimatum which she, then deep in rehearsals for Cherubini's Medea, ignored. In exasperation, he sent her a telegram cancelling her contract.
Maria Callas isn't fired. Maria Callas is severed.
That night, she came to the theatre looking like an empress.
Nicola Rescigno.
She wore a ermine thing that draped to the floor, and she had every piece of jewelry she ever owned. She said, you all know what's happened. Tonight, for me, is a very difficult night, and I will need the help of every one of you. Well, she proceeded to give a performance that was historical.
After the performance, the press descended on her dressing room, and the questions about Bing's actions went on until 4 in the morning.
We started quarreling involuntarily on my side, of course, because... No, I didn't think, of course, it was a quarrel. I just refused the next year's contract because he offered me the old repertoire, that is the old Norma staging, Barbara Seville, Traviata, Lucia, and I said, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do routine. I want new performances and staged well. You know, like here, like a little young Callas is doing, my God. Yes, I suppose that made him angry. I don't know. I mean, I can't explain it otherwise.
20 years later, in 1978, Rudolf Bing recalled the incident.
Well, it was just a question, does she run the Met or do I run the Met? And at that time, perhaps very wrongly, I felt that I was running the Met. I mean, obviously, Callas was treated, kid glove is an understatement. Every wish she had, and they were usually reasonable, but occasionally she became just intolerable. So eventually the moment came when I had to say, sorry, contract cancelled. Was she that much more difficult than other artists? The answer is yes. And I think mainly because she was that much more intelligent. With most artists, you could argue, but eventually you could get them around, so to speak. Callas you couldn't get around. She knew exactly what she wanted, and she knew why she wanted it. And that made things very difficult.
Nicola Ricigno agreed to a point.
Maria was a little bit of an egomaniac, which was sometimes difficult to take. Professionally, she was difficult because she was a perfectionist, and she expected of others the same degree of preparation that she brought to a performance. But personally, Maria had many, many insecurities. I think a lot of it was due to her childhood, her relationship with her mother, the rivalry with her sister, who was Mama's favorite, and she was like the ugly duckling.
In the summer of 1959, Callas and her husband were invited by Aristotle Onassis to join him on his yacht, the Christina, for a cruise. Among the other guests was Winston Churchill, and at the beginning of the trip, the press concentrated on him. By the end of it, however, it was Callas and Onassis who were the centre of attention. Within a few months, Callas and her husband Meneghini had separated. In New York, Callas was besieged by reporters eager for news of her relationship with Onassis.
I'm giving no interview.
Why did you cut short your trip?
Please.
Are you going to marry Mr.
I said don't. I'm not answering any interview. Now stop it.
Are you glad to be back in New York? That's an uncontroversial question.
Well, I'm happy I'm not staying more, if that's what you mean.
Why is that?
Why not?
Because we're bothering?
Because I'm leaving, my God. Use your mind a bit.
So you're going to sing in a Met again?
I hope so.
You do hope to come back to the Met?
Not this season.
You may not, Mr. Bing?
No more fights. I'm sorry for you.
Do you expect to sing next season?
We don't know yet.
What are you hoping to sing?
I can't say anything.
Do you hope this trip in Italy will end this romantic squabble that everyone's been predicting?
This is no romantic squabble. It's a separation. That's all.
Many people have condemned Meneghini, but artistically speaking, Maria functioned as an artist because it was just the house and the theater. With the advent of Onassis, it gave Maria something that as a woman she had never known before. When Onassis wooed a woman, it was like an emperor wooing a goddess. Planes were put at your disposal, boats. I mean, I remember having dinner with both of them many times in Paris. I mean, you'd walk into these famous restaurants, everybody would be on their knees. It was the best that that type of life could offer. On the other hand, I must admit, it was the beginning of her downfall. And I think that she would have been, as an artist, much better off had she never met Onassis.
Callas now began a 9-year relationship with Onassis, during which she began to fulfill herself as a woman, but suffered artistically. There were no operatic appearances for 2 years, just a few concerts. In an interview in London, she declared her intention only to appear when the artistic atmosphere was attractive to her. She felt, she said, a duty to herself and to art to work the least possible and the best possible. In 1963, Zeffirelli went to Paris to convince Callas to appear in a new production of Tosca, which he was planning for Covent Garden the following year. To his surprise, he found she wasn't keeping her voice in trim, but was nevertheless anxious to return to the stage. Her interpretation of the role was intense. In fact, it could be said that she didn't interpret the role of Tosca, she lived it.
It's a little bit my idea of a grand guignol. The first act, for instance, you cope with a woman that really is, if not hysterical, nervous. So that is why she comes in and out, and she's anxious and a nuisance also, rather. And all she was really interested was in finding her Cavaradossi.
In the London production, the role of Scarpia was sung by the Italian baritone Tito Gobbi.
With Maria, I was Scarpia and she was Tosca. And that is the difference. I have been singing this role with so many sopranos, with all the sopranos in my time, and everyone has a good interpretation. But Maria was never Maria, was Tosca on stage. One day, during a rehearsal, she was running towards Scarpia. She arrived to my chest and she started beating my chest, L'Anniver, L'Anniver. And so I catch her hands and I open her arm like this, like crucifying her. And that was a wonderful sensation. It was really like crucifying Tosca. And she asked me to do it again next performance.
Her return to the stage coincided with a new series of recordings, but given her increasing vocal difficulties, this too was becoming a problem. But her triumph as Tosca in London led to a new Zeffirelli production of Norma in Paris later that year. During those Paris performances, Rudolph Bing arrived in the city and he and Callas were reconciled, and she agreed to return to the Met in 1965 as Tosca. The performances were sold out within hours and people queued for 4 days for standing room. Callas's first entrance as Tosca brought the performance to a halt.
I was told that they loved me. Before I went back, I really sincerely tell you I was terrified. I didn't want to, and I was trying to find excuses not to go. But as soon as I came out and the applause started enormously, one thing I was happy about it, but then the first thing I wasn't, because it stops the entrance of Tosca, which could be a very nice part of music, though I knew it would happen, but to such an extent I never thought.
After appearing in another series of Normas in Paris, Callas returned to London for a single performance of Tosca on July the 5th, 1965. It was her last performance in opera, and in fact her last public performance for 8 years. She gave up her American citizenship and assumed Greek citizenship instead, thereby leaving herself free to marry Onassis. The marriage never took place. Nicola Rescigno explains.
His hobby was collecting famous women. When a woman came along that was more famous than Maria, he dropped Maria. And it was a great tragedy for Maria, because I really think Maria loved him very sincerely. So that when she was abandoned by Onassis, I think it was the big crisis in her life. Maria was never the same again.
In the summer of 1968, Lawrence Kelly found Callas in the American hospital in Paris, where she'd been taken after a suicide attempt, the result of Onassis ending their affair. He convinced her to return with him to Dallas, where she was left in the care of the music critic John Ardoin.
Maria was sort of left in my care for prima donna sitting, shall we say. And we became very, very close in that period. We spent every day together. We'd go shopping to the grocery store, to the drugstore, to buy her astrology magazines, which she liked, or to take her to movies. And during that time, I asked Maria if I could tape an hour interview for a radio program that I was doing in Dallas.
Being honest is a hell of a price to pay. You might be, as I have found out, frequently misunderstood, hated, attacked. And I have not been able to fight back. It hurts. You hate it because it is unjust. The world is full of unjustness.
And then, my Lord, if you realize that I'm a woman, and by woman I mean a woman with all her weaknesses, I mean, I'm undefended. I've been undefended all my life. On the other hand, if people love you, why do they love you? Not because I sang a beautiful aria or a note. What am I? Is she only a machine for singing? No. She's a human being. I need help, too. Life, they say, is terrible. Of course life is terrible if we make it that way. Life is hard. Of course it's hard. And I like to, sort of sit back and enjoy my celebrity and money. But on the other hand, I can't. I've got to help myself. Since I was a child, I knew I had to help myself.
Obsessively, she returned to the subject of analysis. And I remember her saying, how could a man be so cruel? And then she broke down and started crying. It was a very embarrassing moment for me. I didn't know what to do. I took her in my arms, where she stayed for just a moment, and then she pushed herself away and went to the bathroom to wash her face and pull herself together. To my great surprise, when she came out, she said, have you got another reel of tape? And I said, sure. She said, well, put it on.
For 9 years, you've been living a hidden life and a humiliating life for a person like I am, and you're not cured in 2 months. And I don't have that much time to get cured. Next year, I've got to sing somehow or another. I don't care at what price. I've given up a hell of a career. And it's too easy to say, oh, thank you very much. For 8 years, 9 years, we did our best to be happy. Oh, ain't that sweet, as they say vulgarly. So easy to say no resentment. Sure, Christianity says you must forgive, you must be no resentment. I don't have resentment, but I have hurt. How can I get rid of that? One last cigarette and you drive me home?
Speaking publicly, however, Callas told a different story.
I left him of my own accord. We both agreed to that. Because we loved each other maybe too much. No regrets. Oh, no. Otherwise I would have married him. I had every occasion. I would be happy to see him happy under any circumstances. And if he's happy with Jackie, I'm more than happy for him. I had a lover, that's that.
Left alone, however, Callas desperately needed to fill the void left by Onassis. She was afraid to return to the stage, and a recording session in 1969 showed how her voice had deteriorated. Once again, her friend Nicola Ricigno was the conductor.
I remember with great anguish those last sessions, but the voice had deteriorated. She knew it, and she couldn't recapture certain of the things. There were glimmers of greatness. She would try to do something, and it wouldn't. Many times couldn't succeed. Other times we got close to it, and it was like seeing a giant fall.
A brief excursion into film followed, but this was only mildly successful. Still terrified of singing in public, she undertook an extended series of masterclasses at the Juilliard School of Music, coaching young professional singers in matters of style and interpretation.
I want the attitude of a sure girl, young but sure. What are the words you think? She's just heard a voice. Now you can smile, Elindor, but smile with love, not that kind of smile.
Though more successful in this role than in acting, Callas was unfulfilled as an artist. During these masterclasses, Giuseppe Di Stefano, with whom she'd shared many artistic triumphs, re-entered her life, but this time as a lover. Working together, they directed a production of Verdi's I Vespri Siciliani in Turin, and they made a recording of operatic duets. Urged on by Di Stefano, she undertook a world concert tour with the tenor. By her own admission, the voice was no longer at its best, and some of the performances were embarrassing. The vibrato was now plainly out of control, the timbre dull and thin, and the high notes dangerous. But even more upsetting was the fact that this great singing actress couldn't convey anything dramatically anymore. Her final public performance took place in Japan on the 11th of November, 1974. following year, Onassis died, and in truth, with him, something died in Callas also. Soon afterwards, her relationship with De Stefano ended.
I often wonder, will I ever really be happy, or will I really pass my life always struggling to survive? I'd rather hope for the worst and have the best. If you do eat something that's good, you don't want it because you're so afraid. Because they care for 1 day, 1 month, 1 year. And then what? So my hopes have been, up to the skies and then bang down. When you're that old, what does one do? Sit in the four walls. I've been facing four walls all my life. How can I go out and, sort of walk your feet off until you're so dog tired you go to bed? I'll be picked up. Beginning to think I should get a big dog and have him around. It's the only thing.
I think Maria was not really a very happy person.
Tito Gobbi.
She had some good moments in her life, but I never saw her really happy. I remember one day in New York, I asked her for dinner with my family, my wife and my daughter, and she said she was alone, so come with dinner with us. We had a wonderful dinner, we enjoyed a lot. She was playing and acting and making fun with Cecilia, my daughter, and then when we took her to the lift of the plaza, she said, listen, I'm alone, I'm so lonely here. I have not even my little dog to keep company. Why don't you buy me another ice cream and I stay a little longer with you?
I don't think there are very many men that would like to be with me because they're afraid of me. I'm a fast thinker. They're afraid of being exposed with me. It's not easy to be a good friend at Callas.
She became more and more a recluse, unwilling to go out in public or to meet friends. Giuseppe De Stefano.
She said, ogni giorno, per fortuna, un giorno di meno. Every day, thank God, is 1 day less.
On the morning of September the 16th, 1977, she suffered a massive heart attack and died in minutes. But more than 20 years later, she remains alive through her recordings, which now excite a generation who never heard her in person. Nicola Rescigno.
The name of Maria Callas today is stronger, I would say, than when she was alive. She serves as the example of the complete artist, and she died at an age where it's right to die, to leave a legend.
Franco Zeffirelli.
There has been perhaps only one faithful companion to Maria throughout her life, her loneliness. The price sometimes one has to pay for his glory and his success.
And Tito Gobbi.
I'm sure Callas will remain in the history for a long, long time. In 100 years, people will still talk about Maria Callas as a beautiful and unique star which was crossing the sky of opera for a rather short time, but giving light forever.